So if you're coming from the Python world, one way to, I think, get accustomed to the idea of thinking about how Ruby uses blocks is to think about how Python iterators work. So if you reach back to your advanced Python knowledge, in Python, we can define our own iterator by defining a constructor. So let's suppose we wanted an iterator that will return successive elements of the Fibonacci sequence up to some value. We could basically construct an iterator saying how many of those values we're interested in generating. And we have to define a method called under_iter that will return an iteration object, and a method under_next that knows how to generate whatever the next thing in that iterable should be. And then when we want to use it in our code, we might say something like for n in fib of 5, and then we do stuff with n. So the Pythonic version is actually not too far structurally from a sort of equivalent Ruby version. In Ruby, what we would do is just, we would define a plain old class. We would define a plain old constructor for that class. And as a refresher, the default constructor in Ruby is always called initialize, even though you have to call it with new from your code. And then the only other thing we really have to do is define each as an instance method on the class. So somehow each has to keep track of what the most recent Fibonacci number that was generated and know how to generate the next one. And then in our code, we would call it by saying fib new of some value, and then each, just like we were iterating through an array, right? So each is just a plain old instance method. And now the next question is, how does the each method actually provide those values back to the thing that's calling it? They do it with something called yield. So here's an example of yield in real life. Imagine that you've got a standard IO library, you've got a way to open a file, and you've got a way to close a file. And so a typical flow that you would see in your code if you want to do some things on the contents of the file is you open the file. Usually you get back something called a file handle or a file descriptor. You do some stuff with the contents of that file. And when you're all done, because you're a good citizen, you close the file. Another way that you could do it, though, and in fact, the way that it's implemented in the Ruby standard library, is when you call open, here's a version of open that when you open the file name, it does something to actually open the file, and then it says yield. What is yield going to do? It transfers control back to the place from where you were called. So this is basically how each does its magic. If you are defining your own class and you're defining an each method within it because you want your class to be able to quack like an enumerable, for example, somewhere in your each method, you are going to say yield. And yield means this is where control goes back to the place where it was called and pass back to that thing whatever the next item in the collection is. So what does that look like in your actual code? Here is the new version of my function where I say file open foo, and now I just have a do block and an anonymous lambda. I just have a do block and an anonymous lambda. I'm gonna have to say that like 3 times for the recording, right? In this version, there's a do block and an anonymous lambda. And notice, where does this parameter f comes from? This is the thing that is being yielded by the yield call. So the control flow in this example is I call file open with an argument foo. Control immediately transfers to the open method. The open method does whatever it needs to do to actually open the file. Then it yields the file descriptor that you can use to operate on it. That means as a result of yield, control is now back here. I am now in the body of my anonymous lambda with this parameter f representing the thing that was yielded. So this is basically how iterators in Ruby are implemented, but the same mechanism can be used in a lot of other ways. And you'll see that this is actually used all over the place in the Rails framework. It's actually how views are done. So the sort of high order bit of yield is that it yields an argument to the block. That means that whatever resulted in calling the function that yields, that thing is expected to have a block after it. Recall that a block is just a do and end, perhaps with 0 or more arguments, that behaves like an anonymous lambda. So, sort of like I said, one thing that's always true, if you're implementing each, you're going to call yield somewhere. The other thing that's true is that if something is calling a method that uses yield, that thing had better have a block because there has to be some place to yield to, right? If you go back in the literature, like many decades, this is sometimes called coroutines, as opposed to a subroutine where you're here and then you call a subroutine and it finishes and you're back. Coroutines call each other back and forth. So each time you call each, the thing that implements each is going to get control, but as soon as it hits a yield, control goes right back. and it sort of ping-pongs between the two. The first time you see this, it's a little bit kind of hairy to get your head around it, but you get used to it fast. So yield is one of those things that is absolutely unusual in Ruby because I can't think of another widely used modern high-level language that has an equivalent mechanism. So this is one that's worth spending a little time on.